A very warm welcome to all of you, and apologies for the slight delay. I would request you to switch off your mobile phones, and I would request my younger sister, Girija, who will be coordinating the event from Washington, because my dad has these, so we both take turns, one of us, and so this time it's Girija's turn, and she's in DC, so she'll be welcoming everyone and taking it over from here. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, Him. And I'm also very glad that I'm able to keep my turn. It is my proud privilege on behalf of the D.S. Borker Memorial Foundation to welcome you all, ladies and gentlemen, to the 24th D.S. Borker Memorial Lecture. Professor Shiv Visvanathan, Professor Ramin, Jahanbegloo, Dr. Shareen, Joshi. For 21 years, we met today on the 24th of August at the Deshmukh Auditorium at India International Center in New Delhi for the lecture in memory of Dadaji. But over the last 2 years, due to the pandemic, we held the function via a special webinar. This pandemic has led to a new normal and some value additions too. The special webcasts have led many more to join us live beyond this auditorium from across India and the world. Keeping this larger audience in mind, this year we are holding the function in a special hybrid format, physically at the IIC New Delhi, as well as being streamed live on the YouTube channel. For this 24th lecture, we all with our families should have been in New Delhi to welcome you. Instead, I'm speaking to you from Washington, DC on this webcast. But my parents, Sudha and Subhas, and my elder sister, Hem, and her family are in the Deshmukh Auditorium with you. I now have the privileged opportunity to introduce Dr. Shareen Joshi, who to all of us in the family is Hardy Uncle's daughter. Hardayal Singh, or Hardy Uncle, was a close friend of Shekhar Uncle's and has been a very, very close family friend from the time I can remember. Shareen will be introducing the 24th D.S. Borker Memorial Lecture, the speaker, Professor Shiv Visvanathan, and the chair, Professor Ramin Jahanbegloo. Shareen is also joining us from Washington, D.C. She is an assistant professor of international development in the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, Washington, D.C. A PhD in economics from Yale University. Prior to her appointment at Georgetown, Shareen held a postdoctoral fellowship in the Department of Economics at the University of Chicago. As an applied microeconomist, Shareen uses tools from economics and statistics to understand the processes of economic development from the bottom up. Much of her work focuses on human capital and agency, that is the capacity of individuals to invest in themselves and transform their lives through their own decisions. Shareen has a strong interest in studying the effectiveness of poverty alleviation programs and policies. She has published in top economics journals as well as demography and population studies. She's also an associate editor of the Journal of South Asian Development. Shareen has also served as a consultant for the World Bank, the UN, the Hewlett Foundation, Government of India, McKinsey, and several nonprofits. We thought Shareen would be the ideal choice to do the introduction for academics like Shiv Visvanathan and Ramin, Jahanbegloo, whose work takes an interdisciplinary approach to the social sciences, since Shareen has the added advantage of objectivity of being an academic from the Indian diaspora in the US with work that focuses on South Asia. Over to you, Shareen. Thank you, everyone. Please take care and stay safe.
Thank you, Girija, for that very warm introduction. I feel like my body is in DC, but my heart is very much in Delhi tonight, or rather morning over here. So thank you again to all of you for inviting me. It's really an honor to be here today. My vision for India, 2047 AD. The D.S. Borker Memorial Lecture Series has moved relentlessly towards 2047. Year after year, we hold this lecture. Today, it is the 24th lecture, and we have 25 years to go before we reach 2047, the 100 years of Indian independence. At that point, it'll be the 49th lecture in the series. A civil society initiative instituted in 1999, this lecture is held in the memory of D.S. Borker, civil servant and public sector administrator, on August 24th at India International Center, Delhi. The COVID-19 pandemic had us move the physical function at IIC to the virtual world in 2020 and 21. The lectures were delivered via special webinars, but this year it's being held physically and linked live via special hybrid platform on a YouTube channel. DSB, or Nath to friends, a civil servant, public sector administrator, a strong advocate of physical education for India, a proponent of the idea of play streets in Indian cities, a secular Democrat, always willing to stand up for the poor and the weak above all, a man who was known for his human approach and his simplicity. Shri D.S. Borker was, by all accounts, a brilliant civil servant. He contributed enormously to public policy and governance during his long stint in public management. The large crowds that his memorial lecture attracts every year are a testimony to the qualities of both head and heart. Born in Bombay on the 17th of August, 1911, he had his early education in India and went on to England for further studies. Upon India's independence, DSB joined as the private secretary to N.V. Gadgil, a member of Jawaharlal Nehru's first Union cabinet. Who worked with dedication and a sincerity of purpose. An incident pertaining to the post-partition period, when Delhi was still in the throes of communal riots, has been recorded by N.V. Gadgil in his memoirs and is worthy of mentioning here. Here's the incident. DSB saved the life of Hussain Imam, ex-chairman, Council of State, member of the Constituent Assembly from Bihar, and member of the Working Committee and the Central Parliamentary Board of the All India Muslim League, and a close associate of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. He saved the life of Hussain Imam from desperate mobs and personally escorted him to Safdarjung Airport and put him on a plane to Patna on the 8th of September 1947. He did this at grave risk to his own life. This was his commitment to the values he held dear. DSB had varied interests, but particularly physical education. In 1940, George Allen and Unwin, publishers in London, published his book, Physical Education for India. The book is now kept in a rare section of the library at the University of Oxford, where it has been sourced by the family. In this book, he fervently appeals for creating a fitter India. His book and articles in leading newspapers also advocate for the innovative idea of play streets. Certain streets during specific hours of the day were to be closed down to vehicular traffic to enable children to play on them. This experiment was actually tried with some success in some cities of the UK. The scheme mentioned in Borker's book was appreciated throughout the editorial columns of the Times of India, May 7th, 1940 to be specific. His contributions also brought him honor and recognition. He was the first delegate of India to the World Congress of Physical Education that was held in Stockholm. In November 1939, he received the Ling Gold Medal from the King of Sweden. When the temples of modern India were being built and planned and built, D.S. Borker was working in the Planning Commission's Committee on Planned Projects. He also worked in public sector organizations like Hindustan Steel, where he was the first officer to join. There's also State Trading Corporation, Fertilizers Corporation, and the Engineers India. A versatile personality indeed. The Borker family can feel legitimately proud of these accomplishments. The idea behind the D.S. Borker Memorial Lecture Series on My Vision for India 2047 AD is to strengthen our secular democratic values and traditions, to encourage the process of thinking and regarding the kind of India we want in 2047, 100 years after independence from colonial rule. This series is unique. It has consistently showcased ideas and forward-looking agendas, often contrarian ideas, and often agendas across a remarkable intellectual spectrum. Debate, after all, is an intrinsic and invaluable part of democratic and secular India. D.S. Borker's two sons, Shekhar and Suhas, had initiated this lecture series in 1999. Shekhar was a close friend of DSB, and they were in school together. Shekhar passed away in January 2015. This shall be the 7th time the lecture is being held without him. Speaking on the 25th Memorial Day of DSB, while delivering the 6th lecture in 2004, K.R. Narayanan, former President of India, said, Shri Borker was a remarkable public servant, and very few public servants have had such lectures instituted in their names in Delhi. This lecture is a tribute to his ideas, to his identity with the broader and larger causes of India, and to his great intellect and sympathy for the people and their problems. I want to pay tribute to this remarkable public servant who had made an impact on this somewhat skeptical capital that is Delhi, and the impact is a lasting impact. So here we are. Now we come to this year's lecture. It will be delivered by Professor Shiv Visvanathan and chaired by Professor Ramin Jahanbegloo. Both are very well known and both need no introduction to this audience. but I do have a duty to perform, so please allow me. Professor Shiv Visvanathan is a renowned social scientist and a highly acclaimed author. He is an original thinker and a brilliant academic. He is currently a professor at Jindal Global Law School, Sonipat, and director, Center for the Study of Knowledge Systems at OP Jindal Global University. He is a trained social anthropologist with a PhD from the University of Delhi. He is an Indian public intellectual, best known for his contributions to science and technology studies and for his contributions and for the concept of cognitive justice, a term that he coined. He holds an adjunct professorship at Ramin Research Institute, Bangalore. He was Henry Luce Professor at Smith College in Massachusetts. He was also a visiting professor at Stanford University, Center for Cultural Studies, Goldsmith College, University of London, Center for Science Policy, Arizona State University, University of Maastricht, Holland, National University of Design, Ahmedabad, Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, and Mudra Institute of Communication in Ahmedabad. He has also taught at the Delhi School of Economics and was a senior fellow for the Center for Study of Developing Societies in New Delhi. An interdisciplinary thinker, prolific writer, and delightfully bold and eloquent orator, Shiv's articles and writings reflect his dissection of diverse issues with a sharp and critical wit. His wide interests range from cognitive justice, urban studies, the sociology of corruption and ethics, the sociology and philosophy of science, history of technology and traditional knowledge, social movements, globalization of culture, and politics of ecology, all of which feature in leading newspapers and publications of India. He is the author of Organizing for Science, A Carnival for Science, and Theatres of Democracy, all published by Oxford University Press. He has also co-edited Foul Play, Chronicles of Corruption, published by Banyan Books in Delhi. And now I move to introducing Professor Ramin Jahanbegloo. He is a political philosopher, presently the executive director of the Mahatma Gandhi Center for Nonviolence and Peace Studies and the vice dean of the School of Law at Jindal Global University in Delhi, India. He received his PhD in philosophy from the Sorbonne University. He has taught at the Academy of Philosophy in Tehran. He has been a researcher at the French Institute for Iranian Studies and a fellow at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University. He has taught in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto, has served as the head of the Department of Contemporary Studies of the Cultural Research Center in Tehran, and in 2006 was the Rajni Kothari Professor of Democracy at the Center for Study of Developing Societies in Delhi, India. In April 2006, he was arrested at Tehran airport, charged with preparing a velvet revolution in Iran. He was placed in solitary confinement for 4 months and released later on bail. He was Associated Professor of Political Science and Research Fellow in the Center for Ethics at University of Toronto and an Associate Professor of Political Science at York University in Toronto. He is also a member of the Advisory Board of PEN Canada. He's the winner of the Peace Prize from the United Nations Association in Spain for his extensive academic work in promoting dialogue between cultures. His advocacy for nonviolence, and more recently, the winner of the Joseph Falau in Faber International Essay Prize. And last but not least are his 27 books in English, French, Spanish, Italian, and Persian. These include Conversations with Isaiah Berlin, Gandhi au Sauce de la Non-Violence, Pencil la Non-Violence, Iran Between Tradition and Modernity, India Revisited, published by Oxford University Press, The Clash of Intolerances, The Spirit of India, Beyond Violence, Leghe Gandhi et Tehran, India Analyzed, Talking Politics, Civil Society and Democracy in Iran, The Gandhian Moment, Democracy in Iran, Introduction to Nonviolence, Time Will Say Nothing, Talking Philosophy, and The Decline of Civilization. Without further ado, I request Professor Shiv Visvanathan to deliver the 24th D.S. Borker Memorial Lecture.
Good evening. I'd like to thank the Borker family for creating a commons of anarchy, of debate, of discussion, one of the few places where the argumentative Indian can continue happily. I guess they also are risk takers, especially have to invite a model-headed character like me to give the future of 2047. I want to begin with a confession. Social science has destroyed storytelling. In a deep and fundamental way, what one misses in the future is the storyteller. The storyteller gives you a certain sense of continuity, and I think it was best caught with Maria Vargas Llosa's Storyteller. It's about a tribe where a group of people keep walking, reciting the creation myths, because they know the day they stop reciting the myths, the tribe dies. There's a sense of continuity. There's a sense of the future. The future in that sense is a demand for a different kind of storytelling. Of course, there's a second kind of person I'm very jealous of, and it's the astrologer. The astrologer brings to the future a certainty, a prediction, a guarantee that the future is tailor-made for the client. I have no such guarantees to offer. What I want to do is to show that the future has somehow got separated from utopia and science fiction. The future has become an act of social science. But the future as social science had a wonderful role to play. I can think of 5 instances. In Eastern Europe, the future became a space for dissenting imaginations. In fact, it's quite nice that the Stalinists and the other members of the party ignored the future as a possibility. It allowed everyone from a Zamyatin to a Sakharov to talk of future as a metaphor for freedom. The second thing which I found fascinating was, I was looking at the records of The Hague, where Justice Veeramantri, the Sinhalese judge, debates on the Tahitian objection to the French nuclear testing in the Pacific. And Veeramantri says, the French nuclear testing violates the rights of future generations. The future, from becoming an empty space, becomes an act of trusteeship. The third kind of future I find fascinating is the future discussed in the Indian national movement before the Indian nation state became a proper entity. If you look at the records of the Indian national movement, in fact, I discovered it's more about childhood than the state. It's playful, but we never look at the archives. We freeze it into the well-behaved mannerisms of a nation state. And I can't think of anything more boring than the nation state today. The nation appeals. It's plural. It's playful. The nation state is a parade of boredom. And I think the last few days have convinced me even more that it can't be anything else. But there are 2 other possibilities. I think the Indians, especially in the 30s and 40s, realized that the future was a metaphor for a rule game. And one of the most interesting examples they give is at the time India played hockey for the first time in the Berlin Olympics. For the first half an hour, they played with canvas shoes. Nothing happened. They took it off, played barefoot to score the highest recorded score in Olympic history. We beat the United States 21-0. But the story doesn't end there. The West knew that a barefoot Indian was a dangerous Indian. So they discovered AstroTurf. And the one thing you can't do on AstroTurf is to play bare feet. The nature of hockey changes. But the more important thing, as my father's generation would say, is as long as the West controls the rule game, we lose. We are always a poor second. We have to set the rules of the game in order to make sure we are no longer just second best. And that's a problem that haunts us today. My objection to the current regime is not that it's right. I think it's mediocre. It's boring. You die of boredom. And I think that is the greatest challenge facing us. If you look at India today, in fact, I was recently at a seminar at Ramin Institute where a scientist put it brilliantly to me. He said, Indian scientists today, we are the best summarizers in the world because we don't have a single original idea. And I remember this contrast when William Shockley told my cousin, you come from India? J.C. Bose. And he said, Bose was a genius. The rest is toilet paper. There's a sense of delight, of playfulness in the way we looked at the future. And what I want to say is, to a certain extent, we've lost the sense of the future. What I want to do today is to rediscover it. But there is a danger, because today we live in a regime which is illiterate about time. It has emasculated the past to create some kind of a plumbing as future. And after the COVID, it has frozen the present into a certain kind of normalcy, which is artificial. And thirdly, it has projected the present into the future because it has no idea of the future. How do you rescue India from a situation like this, particularly from a middle class? Because the future, in a way, is therapy for the middle class. But our middle class today is a strange middle class. I wish people like Ashish Nandi would spend more time doing a psychology of the middle class. I mean, let me in fact begin with something that Ashish once told me in private and later in public. He said, the middle class, it's dying of goodness. He said, don't give me good people, they are boring. Good people are correct. I want a goodness that understands evil. And one of the things we are facing today is a social science which has no idea of evil, which lacks a demonology. We have no suspicion of evil, therefore we have no suspicion of violence. We have no theory of genocide. We take it for granted. We have no theory of extinction. We have no sense of obsolescence, of displacement, of all the kinds of violence taking place today. It's not just a question of rape and incestuous brutality. I think there's a certain kind of collective violence which is virtually eliminating India. And we have no storytellers. In fact, as Meda Patkar once told me, the danger of Narmada is the storyteller disappears before the story. The future needs a different kind of narrative. So I'm going to pick a futurist, middle-class social scientist, who, of course, like all social scientists, insists he is original. So he invents a new term, social science fiction. And I'm going to sort of build his idea of what happened. And this man begins very interestingly by saying, it's not revolutions that led to the change of the 2040s. It was boredom. Because the middle class can't stand anything more than boredom. We were mediocre. We were tired of being second best. How long can a regime keep saying it's 9th in disaster management and 10th in development? You need something more. Something which captures a certain sense of genius. I mean, I'm just contrasting this period with an earlier period. I remember Ramin, I'm just working on a biography of him, decided he needed to win the Nobel Prize, announced his Nobel Prize 6 months before the date, booked his tickets, and got the Nobel. And there's a story that follows, which is even more fascinating. Towards the end of his life, I remember Chandrasekhar telling me, Raman decided he wanted to have a second Nobel Prize. And his wife turned around and said, with one, you were intolerable. With two, you'll be insufferable. But there was a magic to that sense of thinking, a sense of play, a sense where they thought they could outthink the future. In fact, I remember once I was in Hungary, I was asked, they said, what do you feel as a native colonial? I said, you picked the wrong person. I came from a family which thought it could outthink the West. And that was a possibility that a lot of us did think of. And it's in this context that I want to begin by saying 3 events eventually made India bored with itself. All of which took place, which I've slightly fictionalized. Around 2 years back, there was a seminar at a small town called Chirala. It was arranged by Max Planck. All the great historians of technology were there. And they invited a whole township of weavers to come. The first 3 days of the seminar, nothing happened. Because all the speakers, white, sat on chairs. And of course, the weavers sat on the ground. And then in a moment of serendipity, P.B. Bijker, the Dutch historian of science, said, why don't we all sit on the floor? The language changed, the conversation changed, the mood changed, the debate changed. Because at that moment, one of the weavers turns around and tells the historian, you not only stole my livelihood, you stole my theory. And then he used a word that surprised the historian. He said, you stole my epistemology. Stealing my livelihood, I can forgive you. Stealing my epistemology, I can't. In fact, there's a joke that follows it. As the word epistemology has now become quite common among activists. I remember at the Harvard seminar, Marty Chen turned around to me and said, why do you Indians use the word epistemology? The World Bank president can't understand it. So I said, precisely. I think we have to understand that this recovery of theory is a recovery of our democracy, is a recovery of our future. And in fact, it's very strange that today, the Dastaka group has in fact told Amit Shah it wants its own research institute, an idea he can't understand. Because as Minister for Cooperatives, to have a craft group say, we want a new research institute, is a language he just is illiterate about. But what are they doing? One of the first things they're showing this group of craftsmen is that Macaulay at India never understood memory. Memory is theoretical. And if we rework memory, we rework the memory of indigo. The original color, the original indigo is reborn. You need the memory of the past to reconstruct the future. Chirala was an actual event, sensational. But the second event that followed happened in a smaller place. It was in Assam, while I was spending my time with Walter Fernandez, trying to do something which everyone thought was futile, build a truth and reconciliation network in the Northeast. And at that time, the discussion was not on truth or reconciliation. It was a debate on the Naga shawl. And I remember this Naga woman turned out and told me, you want to patent this Naga shawl? This soul of our identity? Who do you think you are? And then she proposed something which became quite fascinating. She said, we don't need to secede from India, but we need to secede from the IPR system. And I think she proposed an idea which was brilliant. Epistemic succession. We secede from the knowledge systems which are no longer valid today. And it was that time I was reading Dharampal's book, where Dharampal, in his usual surprising way, says, the first right of any citizen in the 16th and 17th century was secession. Villagers would abandon a village if they got tired of the king. But the Naga woman was proposing something even more fundamental, epistemic secession. What if we were to abandon science and propose an alternative science? What if we were to dump IPR as just a system of greed? And this brings me to my third example. This is also a true story which I've colored up a bit. You know, the one thing that seems to shadow or overshadow India are the Chinese. They're almost boring in their totalitarianism. And I remember Shiv Visvanathan, the retired foreign secretary, make all the right comments the foreign secretary would, that the shadow of China is looming over India. And then the story changes into an apocryphal one. Sitting in the back was an old, young Chinese monk who turned around and asked, "Why don't you Indians outthink China?" There was consternation in the audience because Indians had never thought in recent times of outthinking China. But he said, India as a civilization gave Buddhism to China. It's time for another gift, a civilizational gift of peace. And he said, you people don't understand. We're not worried about the Chinese because the Chinese don't know how to think. The Chinese, he says, are the most undialectical people. They move from thesis to thesis. There is no antithesis. The antithesis is genocide. If you look at every major debate in China, it has ended in genocide. 1 million Tibetans eliminated. 1 million tribals put in jail because they were Muslim. Over 1 million people again eliminated during the Cultural Revolution. Every debate sees genocide as an answer. Don't you think it's time you rescue the Chinese? There was a sense of expectation because many Indians secretly thought they could outthink the Chinese. And in fact, this came to me in a very interesting way when I was having breakfast at Ramin Institute. Breakfast takes time, so you get time to nibble at a newspaper, generally the Hindu. It adds to your respectability with the coffee. And a French biochemist came and sat next to me. He said, why do you Indians want to imitate the Chinese? Why does Modi want to think science is created out of relevance and applied science? He said, the Chinese work like termites. You Indians with your adda think like butterflies. Stay irrelevant as butterflies. There's a beauty to the statement. And I think Ramin Institute is a tribute to that statement. And this is really what I really want to suggest. That suddenly there's an efflorescence of ideas across. In destroying the university, you actually created a university called the epidemic called the university. An epidemic of ideas flowing through every adda. Sometimes I think IIC is secretly a university, pretending to be a club. And it's a brilliant masquerade. What I want to suggest is, today is suddenly a flow of ideas, a gossip of ideas across the country. You won't find it in newspapers. Editorials have dulled out. And I think what I'm trying to suggest is something new is happening. And at that time when I suddenly realized that the Indian move toward democracy was very much like the Occupy movement or the various other struggles going on in Europe. The struggle is not to overthrow a regime. The struggle is not to question political economy. The struggle is to question the very way you're thinking. And David Graeber, an outstanding political scientist, coined something that seemed to fit the Indian idea. He said it's a tacit revolution. It's not the revolution that party cadres bring about. That's boring. It comes full circle and you're dead tired. He said, this is a revolution of categories. It's a revolution that takes place by gossip. And in fact, the first thing he suggested was we return to orality. He says, you Indians are genius at gossip, at adda. Macaulay ruined us by creating textuality. In fact, we became a secretariat to the world. It's a kind of mediocrity which is unacceptable. And more when you see the Trumps and the Erdogans, you realize we can outthink them. But of course, as one of my friends said, yes, we can outthink them provided we do two things. Shut the UGC and stop thinking of education as a tutorial college mechanism. Because the minute you do it, You either make the man who's running quota head of the UGC or shut it down. We need a new style of thinking. And it's in this context that many people suggested that we need a new kind of bhakti movement, where actually you created vernaculars of thought. And we need just that today. And it's in this context that the English political scientist studying these movements made 3 suggestions. He said the one thing you have to understand is what Indians are contending against is enlightenment as an official idea. The Enlightenment overemphasized equality and liberty. Equality produced standardization. Liberty produced individual equality. But there was no theory of difference except a lazy idea of tolerance. Difference is something we need to theorize about. And difference can't be done in the way, I remember when I was in New York, sitting between Wendell Berry and Wes Jackson. I made a speech, and after a while, Wes Jackson, in his typical mulish way, turned around and said, "Idiot." I said, "Now what have I done?" He said, "You said America is a high information society. Do you know we reduced our variety of apples from 166 to 6? And you have 150,000 varieties of rice, 150,000 ways of dreaming, cooking, living. Our constitution has to be a trusteeship of difference." And I remember Madhav Gadkar telling me, "Don't think science can save rice. You need the housewife. You need theories of cooking. You need a new sensorium. You need new notions of difference. You need to link different festivals to different ideas of nature. Nature has to come back. And nature has to come back in a different way." I remember recently the government decided that Ganges is a person. Well, if every PWD department is a person, the Ganges is a person. And I remember G.D. Agarwal, my friend, the IIT professor at that time, conducted a fast. He said a Ganges cannot be a Ganges with 600 embankments. And he fasted to death because the regime wouldn't listen to him, because he said a Ganges which doesn't flow is not a Ganges. Because what flows is not just water, but myth, dream, the future, and the past with it. Agarwal died, and it's a pity hardly anyone noticed it. But it's very interesting that the original idea that the Indians copied from, they are brilliant copiers, but in this case, even disastrous ones, was the Maori idea of the river as a person. Can we now use constitutionalized nature as a person? Can we think of nature in a different sense? Not as a commodity, not in the Judeo-Christian idea of nature, but nature is something lived, as something phenomenological, as something mythic, something creative. In fact, I've known scientists complain today that one of the great absences of modern India is the absence of creation myths. In fact, it's even more fascinating. Last year, I was in Portugal, sitting next to an old woman who was playing around with her computer. And suddenly she said, "I like your speech." And then she said something very interesting. What science needs is an idea of the sacred. It was Isabel Stenger's, Ilya Prigoghin's collaborator. He said, till you restore the sacred back to science, science is not going to work. And your arid secularism is not going to help. As one of them put it, secularism was a parochial attempt of Protestants to respond to Catholics. Why do you want to universalize it? There's a greater magic in the sacred. There's a sense of unexpected in the sacred. There's a language of poetics in the sacred that you have to redeem. I think Patrick Geddes put it brilliantly in his book on J.C. Bose when he said, Indian scientists can only build a new science if they are fed myths during childhood. Where are the myths? In fact, where is childhood as a myth? between the IIT entrance exam and the latest test, you would ruin childhood. Yet the Indian national movement through Theosophy, through Gandhi, through Tagore, was a dream of childhood. We hardly thought about the state. I mean, who worries about the state? And it's in this context that I'm proposing that when we bring nature back to childhood, we rethink nature. Not in the way we are doing today. So when we think of a forest, we think of timber and pulp. I was just reading 2 lectures which are absolutely fascinating. First by Hans Jenny, the Berkeley scientist, who would go up to his class, put on a series of brilliant slides, and then turn to the people in the first row, the smarter ones, and say, tell me what they are. And they would say, oh, Monet, the Impressionists. Jenny would laugh and say, these are actually pictures of soil. There's an aesthetic to soil. There's a right to soil. And we need to create a constitution which recognizes the rights of different soil to exist. Because soil is civilization. Soil is civilizational. And the second book, which was the more recent one, was by Susan Simard, searching for a mother tree. And she says something which I think Ramin told me in a different way. He said, there's no such thing as a car. A car is a grammatical impossibility. It's an oxymoron. Susan Simard says similarly, a tree doesn't exist because a tree is not a unitary thing. A tree through its roots is a neurobiological system of communication which at least connects to 40 other trees. And it creates a spirit of reciprocity where older trees actually sustain younger trees. It's communication, it's the gift. What if we were to bring nature back into the Constitution? And in fact, this is one of the first things that's happening very slowly. I want to push it a bit further. A few years back, by mistake, I became a member of the Constitutional Reform Commission. And at that time, my friend Ramu Gandhi used to feed me more ideas than I can think of. And of course, Ramu was always a man who would never stop at excess. And he told me, write a paper suggesting that the Constitution be based on multiple time. Brilliant idea. Because, just that time I had met Ashish's student, Sachi, and I showed him the Brundtland report. And Sachi, for once in a very wise way, said, very English. He said, only the English think in linear time. My tribals think of shifting cultivation in 15 kinds of time. Linearity and development are not only bad social science, they are bad poetics. How do we return our constitution and ourselves back to a cosmic time? To a time of the future, to a time of what Ramin calls chirological time. A time which demands a different kind of predictability and a different kind of storytelling. And I think this is where we're moving, tacitly. In fact, I was very interested. Recently, I was at a conference where a musician stepped up to me and said, I'm very interested in your work on orality. I said, what for? He said, no, you don't seem to understand. What if you could make the Harikatha part of a constitutional story? Storytelling comes back in a different way because not just a narrative, it's therapy. I worked 10 years on the Truth and Reconciliation Network. What sustained it was storytelling. Desmond Tutu was in fact a fantastic jokester. And I remember one of the first times he's there, he said, I'm a simple man, but I'm the only one where 2 and 2 makes 4. He had a sense of laughter. And you could see that in the final encounter with Winnie Mandela. When Tutu tells her, you must forget. And Winnie says, I cannot forgive. Because if I forgive, I forget. A different kind of storytelling. And that's what we're missing today. Social science is full of boring case studies. Policy is even more destructive. I would shut down the Planning Commission for its want of storytelling. But the storyteller exists in the gossip of our time, in the addas of our time, in old people taking walks. And I think that's where the tacit revolution is taking place. And India is saying it's bored with itself. And India is saying that we have to now outthink the West in interesting ways. And that brings me to the third event. Why can't we outthink China just for fun? Because remember, Indian national movement was playful. In fact, I was thinking of O.P. Vijayan's cartoon, the first one, which everyone knows, which says, Gandhi is asked, what do you think of Western civilization? And he says it would be a good idea. And the next picture, beautifully done, Gandhi tottering on a walking stick. And he's asked, what do you think of Indian civilization? He said, that would also be a good idea. And we have reached that stage. You see, the minute you move civilizationally, it changes. I remember the first time I said this stupidly to a group of army men in Dharwad. And I said, the only way to be an Indian is to be anti-national. The only way to be Indian is to be anti-national in a civilizational sense. And it's that return to civilization we need today. And I think strangely, slowly, if you talk to a lot of people, boredom has become therapeutic. The amount of ideas floating on the ground is fascinating. Craft groups are doing a new history of color. I don't see any chemistry department even hear about it. Deshmukh group is now working on a theory of memory to understand how to recover the idea of indigo. Because memory is not rote, it's epistemological. It's funny, groups on the ground are thinking theory, while our elite in Delhi is thinking policy. There's something wrong. Maybe I'm exaggerating it. But more and more I find that actually it's very interesting to see which kind of writers appeal to people on the ground. And recently I was in Chennai when I was talking to Fazlur Rahman. And he said, have you heard of the second Ziauddin Sada? I said, what? Ziauddin Sada is one of the most translated authors in India. And how it's done, every time he writes something, within 2 days, it's translated into Malayalam. And the translator is also called Zia, a title he wears with pride. If I go to the campus and say, I want to invite Ziauddin Sada, he'll say, who is he? And then if I mention if he is Pakistani, he is banned. But if anyone continues the great sociology of India debates today, it is Zia in his work on post-normal science. Why is it people on the ground are able to pick up the echoes of genius and scholarship? Can we return to it? And India dying of boredom is genocidal. Because then we're indifferent to violence. We're indifferent to storytelling. And we mistake silence for consensus. And that's really what I want to talk about today. But I want to push it further. I think there's a new challenge to India. India has almost been morally bereft since the Panchsheel documents. Apart from the one moment when we invited Tibetans in, we haven't had a great moral movement. But the challenge now is the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is often confused with climate change. And we make it a center periphery model where the West is responsible for the destruction. But it's actually quite interesting. The children seem to think that the Anthropocene is the most brilliant idea in recent times. In fact, it's very interesting that one of the authors recently pointed out the Anthropocene is the fourth cognitive revolution. The first was Copernican, the second was Darwinian, the third was Freudian, and the fourth is the Anthropocene because it challenged the ethnocentrism of man. You look at all the new scientists, Lynn Margulis, Jim Lovelock. They are speaking in terms of a new kind of myth to revive a different kind of science. They know two cultures here. C.P. Snow is dead, not myth. You have to revive it in a different way. And it brings a different kind of storytelling. In fact, if you read the new history of science, it's actually a history of how to retell myth, not method. In fact, of all the most beautiful statements of Peter Berger, the one I remember best is where he said, in sociology as in science, a preoccupation with method makes you important. And that's really what's happening to Indian science, to India as a democracy. Where is the imagination? Where is the imagination of a majoritarian dream which has no understanding of violence, no understanding of the future? And I think what's happening slowly underground, a different kind of rumor, different kind of conversation is going. It's not with the social movements. It's with ordinary people gossiping about the world in a different way. It's not the world of the NRI. I remember a cousin of mine telling me, oh, why are you bothered about Modi? My daughter and my son are both NRIs. But if we don't have the availability of that kind of solution, can we outthink the regime? Can we outthink the very nature of world power? I think that's my vision for 47. It's not a document. It's a piece of gossip. But I don't think India as a civilization can survive without gossip. Quite a few of you would vote for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Viswanathan. You've inspired me deeply. I'm starting teaching tomorrow classes at Georgetown, and so much of what you've said is making me tweak my syllabus. That was deeply inspiring. Thank you. Next, I would request the chair, Professor Ramin Jahanbegloo, to deliver his address. Professor, over to you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the Borker family for inviting me to share this panel with my friend Shiv. Of course, as usual, he has been very insightful and very inspiring, but also very playful. And it's always very difficult to speak after Shiv. It's like playing chess with a 4-year child who doesn't know how to play chess and moves all the pieces around. So Shiv is always like that. There's no way I can get in a logical way, and I don't think it's very necessary to do that. But he resembles very much, he reminds me very much of Borges, where there was no line between imagination and fiction and reality. You didn't know if what Borges was talking about was really a storytelling or it was reality. Now with Shiv is also, I think of meeting Borges again and asking about Cervantes or asking about, I don't know, a Persian play or something, and you don't know in which kind of world you are. But I must confess, imagination and reality, I've always admired Shiv Visvanathan for his independent mindedness and for for juggling with concepts in the best way possible, and also telling stories which half of them are not true and imagined. But there is more to that. I mean, before I get to my very quickly to my comments, I think that they say that thinking is really free when it is done dangerously. And it's more than obvious that Shiv Visvanathan is a person who thinks dangerously, not only in his mode of thinking, because his mode of thinking really hurts the sentiments and interests of those in power, either in politics or even in the academic world, because we share the same university, which has become, which is a corporate university actually, more than anything else. But also because he believes, I think, in thinking critically as an uninterrupted, I would say, mode of living. And that's mostly interesting for me. So we are inclined to believe that critical thinking begins where conformism, complacency, and flattery end. And certainly with Shiv, there is never conformism, never complacency, and never especially flattery. He never flatters anyone. He didn't even flatter Ashish Nandi today. So I would like to continue on this dangerous path, a path with no safety net with Shiv, because he talked without safety net. And I will take my and bring some comments. Of course, when I was listening to him, I was trying to find out where and when is he going to talk or pronounce 2047, and the number didn't come up actually. So, so I don't know if he was talking. I certainly was talking about Indians and India, and he was not talking about Iranians or Moroccans. But I don't know which date he was referring to and which century he was referring to. But anyway, for me, there are some points in what he announced and are important, which I want to make a point here. And it's, I mean, in the discussions that I usually had with Shiv, what is most important, which came up, is the emancipatory vision of Indians like Gandhi or Ambedkar, you know, people of 1947. And I always told him that, you know, I don't see these people anymore in India. Look at our university. It's not producing any students which are in this line of thought. It's not producing any professors who are in this line of thought. So what is happening to India? And he was actually saying it very rightly, I think, because he said there's no memory. And when there is no memory, actually, it means that you have to construct it, but you're living in in uninterrupted forgetfulness, which is the most dangerous thing. You even forget yourself. Not only you forget the people with whom you're living, I mean, you're forgetting the community, but you forget yourself. So that's why we are in the situation that we are. If Gandhi and Ambedkar were both, they had doubts on the established hegemony of Hinduism, and they had doubts about the liberal model of economic and political governmentality, today we find ourselves with the promise of economic affluence, but mostly a challenge, I would say, mostly among an elitist and technocratic ethos. And that's what I think that she was referring to. This, I would say, we are both professors. Some of you actually are students or professors. It's very difficult to teach in a culture of competitiveness and a cult of success. If everybody is running for success, nobody is successful, I would say. And this is what India has become, actually, unfortunately. Void of all forms of moral excellence, which was a point for many people. And that comes, he talked about epistemic and epistemology. I would say that comes from the corporate epistemological arrogance. people that we meet every day around our campus or anywhere else, and people who are not necessarily of a great genius and great brain. They don't read poetry, they don't read novels, they don't watch movies. So I don't know what they have to be arrogant about. Certainly, there's no culture there. And this is what makes it very, very difficult. I mean, my point, so since Shiv will not have time to respond to me, I'm not putting it as a question, but as a comment, is that my interest for people like Gandhi was because I see this inspiration and this imperative that you had in 1947 that you certainly do not have 75 years later, and you will certainly not have it except if there is a magic or something in 2047. And that was that there was this imperative to spiritualize modernity and in some way actually try to get along with another idea of modernity, with a non-Cartesian, I would say. Since you talked about nature, the whole point that we have to go back to nature and we have to find a way to engage in a dialogue with nature is to go beyond the Cartesian project of modernity, you know, that you have to be masters and possessors of nature. And this, I think this is very, very important to understand. And in addition to that, the only thing that it's one of my concerns also, because I also live in Canada. And as you know, there are a lot of Punjabis in Canada. I wouldn't say Indians, they're Punjabis, but they consider themselves as Punjabis, not Indians. But I think that since we're talking about India, we need to talk about another India beyond India. And these are all the Indians who are living outside India. Some of you actually, you also live outside India as an OCI or anything else, or having a Canadian or American or Australian passport. And this, I think, is a big problem. I mean, even in our storytelling, I'm not going to say that for 2047, but in the way that you want to do the storytelling, because who are these Indians? Do they have the same memory as people like yourself and Ashish Nandi and Ashok Vajpayee? Certainly not. And do they live the same myths and the same symbols and the same stories? No. I think that's, again, is one of the issues that we should talk about in an assembly. Maybe next year they will invite somebody who is going to talk about this. Is not going to talk about India 2047, but Indians in 2047. And people who are living outside their homeland, but they're mostly concerned, even if they have this attachment culturally, spiritually, and linguistically to India. But from my own conversations with the Punjabis of Canada, they were much more concerned with the election of Justin Trudeau than the election of Narendra Modi. So that, again, is one of the questions that comes up when we are talking about storytelling. And then, and last but not least, I want to emphasize on not only on the role of these diasporic Indians, which lies outside India, but on one concept that it's in the continuity of what Shiv Visvanathan talked about. He didn't pronounce that because I think he take it for granted, and that's the sense of belonging. You cannot talk about the past or the future without sense of belonging. You need to have a sense of belonging. Sense of belonging is not necessarily always cultural or national. It can be ontological and philosophical and metaphysical also. So this sense of belonging, how can we talk about it today in relation with what Shiv said? Is it a natural sense of belonging to a nation, or is it a form of an inflamed one which becomes intolerant? Now, I think that if we put today's India in the continuity of 1947, those who were fighting for the independence, including Gandhi, Ambedkar, and Nehru, and many others, they knew what this sense of belonging meant, and they could define it very easily. I'm not sure that the corporate mindset of India today knows its sense of belonging, because if you belong to a corporate system, is not belonging to anyone or anywhere or anything, actually. If you're a poet like Ashok Vajpayee, I think you have much more reasons to have a sense of belonging than somebody who is necessarily working for a corporation. So my last point would be, I believe Indians in 2047 beyond India will be exercising certainly an agency in relation to a future, but this future would be without any storytelling, unfortunately, Shiv, as you know that. And this future, actually, we need to recreate it. And maybe the best people who can do that are poets. And maybe we should go back to our poets in India, including Tagore, when he said, where the mind is without fear and head is held high, into that heaven of freedom, my father, let my country wake. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. To sum up, as we stared up, to sum up what both our professors have said tonight, as we stare down the year 2047, I think you've given us a lot to think about, right? I think you're absolutely right. There are big questions in front of us about who we are as people, who we are as a nation, India, the place, versus Indians scattered all over the world. Questions about pluralism, questions about nature, questions about the energy of the grassroots, the ideas that are germinating in those villages and communities scattered all across India, and then the challenges of our time. I think you're right that we must contemplate these deeper questions. I like what you said, Professor Jahanbegloo, about the diaspora, right? And both of you have talked about ideas and how in India, the India of today, it is difficult to find that freedom of expression. We encountered this in the diaspora as well, right? We have deep debates about India, the future of India, but we're doing it under the watchful eye of embassies. I can say personally, where to debate is to risk being called anti-national. As a professor, the eye of the embassy seems to be forever on you. And really, the quote of the night that I would say deeply inspires me is, the only way to be Indian is to be anti-national. Professor, thank you for that. As I look at my own work and look at my own way forward, there's something deeply inspiring about what both of you have said, of the invitation to engage from the diaspora, whether in Canada, the United States, or anywhere in the world. And certainly this idea that the only way to be Indian is to be anti-national. I take that to heart. And with that, I'd like to bring us to the final stage of our program and request everybody in the auditorium to rise for the national anthem.
जय हे
Thank you, everybody. And with this, I will turn it back over to the crowned hosts.
Oh, is it just me?